Global Indian Network. Print, TV, events, podcasts. Find out more at globalindianseries.com.
When did Indians begin to think of themselves as St. Lucians, as in terms of their identity? The idea of shedding some of their Indianness to become accepted, but not just accepted, to be able to climb the social ladder, to do better for themselves and their children. So essentially, in looking at the indentured labor experience, I have been extremely interested in understanding at what point do people start identifying themselves as something other than they originally saw them.
Welcome to the Global Indian Podcast, home to the greatest conversations and the official platform for people of Indian origin. Yes, let's face it, we are everywhere. Welcome back to your weekly podcast where we plunge into the human experience of being a person of Indian origin, take a second look at the countries we now call home, and tackle the big conversations we need to have. In this episode, we continue our journey in the tropical islands of St Lucia to continue our discussions looking at indentureship across the Windward Islands. In this episode, I am joined by none other than the assistant professor in history at the University of Southern Caribbean in Trinidad and Tobago, Dr Terencia Kyneata Joseph. Now, Kyneata specialism is looking at the indentureship within the islands, especially in locations like St Lucia. This is an incredible conversation because last week you heard from Honourable Minister Guy Joseph, who's also a Global Indian Ambassador, and today you'll be listening directly from a historian herself, where she breaks down the monumental moments in the Indian history within the islands and also tackles some of the big conversations we need to have. As always, I'd like to say a massive thank you to all our supporters and sponsors out there, many of which you'll hear from soon. And if you too would like to take part in this living encyclopedia, well, it couldn't be easier. All you simply have to do is go to the website, which is globalindianseries.com. There you can see the entire repertoire of conversations so far, and you can also share your story. I truly hope you enjoy this remarkable conversation.
Hi, my name is Divya and I'm co-founder of the Global Indian Podcast. Before you get to today's show, I've got a quick favour to ask. If you've been enjoying our conversations, I'd love if you could take just 1 minute to leave us a review on the platform that you're listening to us on and share our work to friends and family. It helps us out a lot. Word of mouth is the primary way that we grow. Thanks for your continued support.
Hello, my name is Daniel Trassa and I'm Dean of Nova School of Business and Economics in Carcavelos, Portugal, one of Europe's leading business schools. I'm proud to be of Indian origin, and I invite you to discover these podcasts, which will look to redefine the impact that Indians and their descendants are doing all over the world. In behalf of Nova School of Business and Economics, I wish you a great 2021.
My name is Chitra Stern, and I am a proud Global Indian Ambassador and CEO of Martinal Resorts and Martinal Residences. We pride ourselves on the journeys that define a community, and our developments bring people together. Did you know that over 70,000 people just like us call Portugal home? The Global Indian journey has brought people together in a meaningful way, and on behalf of all of us at Martinal, we want to thank you for joining us in these remarkable conversations. We look forward to seeing you here in Lisbon post-COVID. Have a great day.
And just move. Get up 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 and just.
Is there, okay, Kyneata, I have been incredibly excited to have you on the platform. I'm a massive fan of your work, of your research that you've been doing. And I know just prior to you introducing yourself officially on this guise, as a way of introduction, you have dedicated incredible amounts of time doing research about the Indian experience in the Caribbean, predominantly in St Lucia, St Vincent and Grenada. This research has seen you doing lectures across the West Indies, obviously for students that come in. But it's also been an incredible turning point in the way that people look at indentureship, the harshness of those realities, but also deeply question what on earth identity means. So before we even kick up on that side, you know, the big question that I have for you is, Kyneata, what does identity mean to you?
Okay, so identity for me is how do I see myself? But I also understand how I see myself is connected with my community, my immediate family, then the wider family, then the village I'm from, and even the country I represent. So I feel that I represent. But I also see that so that what I see as myself is also a reflection of that immediate community. But at the same time, someone might just look at me, and I always tell the students, when we come into the classroom, we just see each other as educator and student, but there is so much more behind that, informing who we are in that classroom space. And even who my mother sees who I am, I don't think I am that person, that I am more than what she knows. And at the same time, we are so connected with our community. And when we move between different spaces, people use their experiences to inform what they think your identity is. So one, identity is extremely personal. But I do recognize that people outside of your circle also will want to place identifiers on you, place their experience, their knowledge on who you are. And sometimes there is friction between those two ideas of who you think you are and how others may see you. And sometimes it's very jarring. And so in St. Lucia, I think of myself as a Black person. And that is one of the designations we have. We don't have the designation of African in St. Lucia, really, unless you are actually immediately from Africa. So I would have seen myself, and I still think of myself as Black, because the formative years, when you, between the age of 1 to 10, 11, is how you continue to identify in the rest of your life. So presently, I would describe myself as middle class, but in my head, I'm still seeing myself coming from the lower class, because that's where I knew myself to be as a child. So I say all of that to say that I identify as Black in my mind, but understand that even within St. Lucia, people will assume that I have some Indian heritage. In Trinidad, where I live, and I've been living for more than 20 years, people still will identify me as African in inverted commas. And that's what I recognize through most of my time being in Trinidad. Until very recently, we were hosting a webinar during this COVID period, lockdown period, during the extreme lockdown. And we wanted to have a discussion about what identity means and our place, that is the Caribbean's place, within the whole discussion of racism and the George Floyd related protests and the discussions coming out of that. Now, in my university, our history department is very small. So it's just 3 of us and 4 of us, and all of us appear very African in appearance. And so the title of the discussion was placing the Caribbean within the global context, identity, race, and so on, and decolonizing those ideas. And after the discussion, or during the discussion, so I spoke about St. Lucia and Indians in general, and another colleague spoke spoke about the Trinidad experience and speaking about the different racial groups in Trinidad. And the other colleague spoke about just the American experience. And during the discussion, someone threw into the conversation that one of my friends my colleagues who has an Indian last name, but is African in appearance, said that she did not address the Indian situation adequately for Trinidad. But you know how these webinars go, time goes faster than what you can say. And she did intend to do that, but she didn't get a chance because of the time limit. And the individual was suggesting that the reason why she paid scant attention to Indians, even though she has an Indian last name, is because she's African. Then the individual spoke about me and said, well, the person from St. Lucia spoke more about Indians, where Indians are such a small community, and she looks like she's mixed race. And that was like one of the first times in Trinidad that I had gotten that. And then there was a subsequent webinar, and that came up again. And so in Trinidad, I had been here just seeing myself and seeing that others were reflecting that I was African. Mm-hmm. But within that kind of discussion, people were looking and, you know, dividing me up and looking and you know, it felt so invasive because it was the first time that had happened. And I was like, wow, okay, so in Trinidad, people do see me, if we're having a certain type of conversation, as being a little less African and maybe having some degree of Indian. And it just had me thinking and had everything that I had thought before, not change, but had me reconsider.
Is it that they thought you're more Indian because of the context of your conversation rather than these vices that people have, a social construct to say, well, you have to be identified as a person of African origin because of your complexion and all of those things, rather than actually saying, well, let me go further and let me go deep and let me understand, well, how do you identify yourself as? Was it just purely because of your conversation that made them think?
No, I think because my hair, well, it depends on how I have my hair, and that is, so today you seeing, it looks more African textured, but sometimes I have it differently and you can see the straightness in it. And that day it was straighter than it is today. And so in Trinidad, it's not just the complexion, it's what your hair looks like. Very, it's tied into that. And so it had me thinking about my identity, but for myself, I think I see myself firstly as a St. Lucian, and then the other things come in. And I've really been thinking about it. I understand that there is possibly an Indian element within myself, but that is not what informs what my interests are. My research focus is, or even how I live. So I celebrate, coming to Trinidad, I celebrated all the Diwali, Pagua, and so on, which is not celebrated in St. Lucia. But I also celebrate the dragon festivals in Trinidad, which the Chinese. So I see myself as very cosmopolitan in thinking, and I think a lot of that has to do with my my background as someone interested in history. So I would not, and so if someone were to ask whether I identify as Indian, I'm like, well, what I think Indian is probably not. If you ask a Trinidadian or someone from India or an Indian, someone of Indian descent from the UK, I probably won't say that because I understand what people see as those things. But essentially, an Indian is a human being. That is it. So that is my very long response to that question.
So, but let's take away the social construct of what other people would define you as being because of the lens that they reflect themselves on. Would you class yourself as an Indian?
I won't use that word. I've never used that word. It would
A person
always,
of Indian origin.
yes, that, and it's not just in terms of, I'm thinking in terms of blood, but certain aspects of our culture. Yeah.
But what, so where do you see the difference between person of Indian origin and Indian? Because are you saying Indian in the sense of a nationalism, passport, and
No, I'm definitely not seeing it as a passport also. I'm just thinking that there are nuances in how we use the word Indian. So in a place like St. Lucia, the term Indian will not be used for St. Lucians of Indian descent. It will be used for persons who have recently arrived from India.
yeah.
It will not even be used for an Indo-Trinidadian. It will not be used for an Indo-Guyanese. So you see those nuances. Now in Trinidad, we use the word Indian, and it is understood often that it means an Indo-Trinidadian. And they will make a distinction with somebody who is from India. And if you're Indian descent and you're from Canada, you're an Indo-Canadian. You're a Canadian first.
Absolutely.
But you're Indian.
Because it pays homage to ancestry, but not necessarily placing you within that construct of saying these are what your behaviors should be if I were to think of somebody from understood. Why do you introduce yourself to the audience about the work that you've been doing?
Okay, so my work is centered on the Indian Indentured Experience, and the focus has been on St. Lucia for my undergraduate and PhD thesis. That was my focus. But having completed that, I did begin to look beyond the indentured period. And for a place like St. Lucia and even St. Vincent and to a lesser extent Grenada, you see that the word Indian or anything related with persons of Indian origin disappears after 1920 from the official documents. So trying to piece that together has been very difficult. And I do have to go back to maybe the archives at Kew Gardens in the UK to try to sift through some of that. But I have begun doing some comparative work between among the Windward Islands, that is St. Lucia, Grenada, and St. Vincent, and see what that experience is, and to compare that to what happened in Trinidad, Jamaica, and other places. So in looking at the Indian indentured experience, I have also examined the position of women. I'm very, very interested in the position of children, and I have examined that because about 5% of the migrating Indians who came to St. Lucia were children who accompanied a parent. And when I say children, that would include what was referred to as minors, so persons below the age of 15. And examining whether parents felt compelled because of the economic circumstances to indenture those children, but also thinking about what did the migration of those young persons into the St. Lucia context mean. And what my work has delved in terms of Indian children is that the government would have targeted children to ensure that their parents remained in St. Lucia and did not migrate, return to India or migrate to other places. So one of the things that they attempted to do was offer education, and that education had to be in English. And so another thing you saw them doing is that if any child was orphaned, the state would take that child and place that child in someone's home to be a domestic. So there was the deliberate targeting of Indian children. Oh, yes, the other thing they did, the government would have passed a law to say that children of indentured parents who did not qualify to get the free return passage, that the parent would now have to pay for those children to return to India. That had not been the initial law. So in the 1880s, they did that to ensure that they got a hold of those children. And if the parents couldn't pay for them to return to India, then the parents would have to remain because they wouldn't want to leave their children. And so I was very interested in looking at how the state targeted that group of individuals who may have identified themselves a little more with St. Lucia than they did with India. Obviously, I would have identified with India, but their navel string may have been buried in St. Lucia, and that would mean something to them. And the idea that most of them would have been speaking French Creole, and that is what the records indicate. And we assume that children will begin speaking the language that is around them, all the languages around them. And so all of that I was examining because I wanted to understand, when did Indians begin to think of themselves as St. Lucians, in terms of their identity? When did that begin in St. Lucia? Because when we look at Trinidad and Guyana, I think the idea of Indianness and being Indian went beyond the 1920s. And so I have been interested in that idea of identity. And as I would have mentioned previously, I was very interested in understanding the decision-making processes of Indian migrants in terms of how integrated, or when they would decide they wanted to seem more integrated into the society. And the idea of shedding some of their Indianness to become accepted, but not just accepted, to be able to climb the social ladder, to do better for themselves and their children. So essentially, in looking at the indentured labor experience, I have been extremely interested in understanding at what point do people start identifying themselves as something other than they originally saw themselves as.
What do you think will be the determining factor of that? When does that shift happen? Because we know with the migrant community, wherever you go, the smaller the community, some cases, the more difficult it is to hold on to some form of identifiables that you can all share that common denominator with. The larger the community, just as a human aspect, the easier it is, because therefore the native tongue, traditions, cultures, food, cuisines, what you can get hold of, almost reinforces that to the degree that the pendulum swings the other way, that you start to segregate yourself in some weird ways to the communities that you've actually now belonged to.
Yeah, so in looking at the Indian community in the Windward Islands in St. Lucia in particular, the numbers made a significant difference. But what may have made the biggest difference is where they entered the society. They entered the society at the lowest levels. So if they would have entered to come in as artisans and skilled workers, they would have been in a position where they would have been able to hold on to their culture a little bit more, because they would have a little more power. But having entered at the bottom of the society, their ability, their agency was a little less. And the fact that they were in small numbers made it even more difficult. So you enter in a world where you are almost powerless, and therefore a community which is already set in its identity, in its culture, and so on, and you have to now fit in. If you're coming in at a different level, you can say, I don't need to fit in because I have my skills and this is what I am here for. that I can, if I want to return home, I can do that on my own accord. I can lobby the government. But when you're at the bottom of the social ladder, you don't have those abilities.
What do you think is the biggest misconception people have of indentureship within the Caribbean as a whole?
The biggest misconception is that although people don't have a conception, they don't have an understanding. Outside of Trinidad and Guyana and Suriname, within the general Caribbean, people don't know the history of indentured labor and so on. So that would be the first thing I will say. The second thing I will say is that in terms of the misconception, is the idea that, and I will always argue that generally Indians arrive willingly, but the idea that there were these extreme situations which kind of push people into migrating. And so, yes, there was the willingness in terms of wanting a better future. How they were presented with the idea of the better future obviously was not presented truthfully. And many of us don't understand that it was still a system of unfree labor. So similar to the system of chattel slavery, which existed previously, it was a system of unfree labor, where workers, where the migrants did not necessarily, for a period of time, for 5 years, were not free to sell their labor elsewhere, were not free to determine where they lived, to determine what their diet was like. All of that would have been prescribed by what existed on the plantation. And I think people don't understand that. And the other thing is we don't think, because especially if it's coming from history and people feel very distant, they cannot imagine what the everyday lives were for these individuals. And because of the inability to identify, to relate with these individuals, they cannot begin to see how the system of slavery which existed previously was not broken off. The ideas, the behaviors of the former enslavers, of the estate owners and so on, that these things permeated into the new system of slavery, of indentured labor. And that would have an impact on the experiences of the individuals, how the employers, so-called employers, would try to recreate as much as the law would allow them to a new system of slavery, as you Tinker describes it as.
Yeah, because I think when we look at certain parts of the Caribbean, we see the ugly rise of identity politics. And people use this rise of indentureship and slavery. Who had it worse? What was it like? But I think sometimes it's just a social lubricant for oneself to kind of push off on the other that you've had it easier, you've had it harder. But what you're saying is actually indentureship was brutally tough. It wasn't easy. People didn't come from choice. We heard that when we were doing some research, up to 40% of those on the ships died. And I think you were telling me as well, many of those, I think, was it 50% died within the countries in brutality of loneliness, neglect in terms of medicinal support, and they're totally dislocated from culture, language, and tradition. How do you think that's impacted communities now?
The way in which it has impacted them is that I think in some ways, persons feel very removed from what it means to be Indian, however they want to imagine it, but in terms of having the culture. And many stereotypes would have come through up to this point in time in terms of, and a lot of the stereotypes are related to the experience of indenture. So I would have mentioned to you, and not just the experience of indenture, but what continued after in terms of the lack of health care and so on. So I would have mentioned one of the ideas that has come through the years is that in St. Lucia, that Indians don't have good skin. And that idea came from the many diseases that Indians living on an estate in close proximity to others would have encouraged, and the lack of health care. So yaws or yas, as it's pronounced in Trinidad, and bilharzia and all those diseases were found to be very prevalent among Indians. So that stereotype, which maybe during my time as a child, I knew, that is something that came through the ages. But in terms of other areas, I think Indians in St. Lucia have found it very difficult to celebrate their culture outside of their private homes. So I will visit my friends who are of Indian origin during like Christmas and other celebrations, and they will bring out all the Indian dishes, which with all the ingredients, which I wouldn't have known as a child that was there. In fact, one of my friends said, yes, my uncle is a chef and he does all the Indian dishes. And I mean, the names are different in St. Lucia to Trinidad. Some of them, the names have come up through the ages, or some have new names. But that is in their homes. When I've spoken and interviewed persons, they would sing some of the songs. They would give me recordings actually of some of the celebrations, and I would listen to them, and you can hear some of the Indian instruments. But all of that is happening in the private home because maybe they want to keep it special, but I think to a large extent because it might be frowned upon. That although we want to say that we are accepting of those things, maybe persons feel that it will not be something that the society would celebrate.
Yeah. Out of the countries you cover, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and Grenada, which governments have recognized in there the power of identity, but also celebrating those identities as a multicultural hub of what the Caribbean offers?
I think in St. Lucia, in terms of the wider culture, people think that they are a mix of different races, and they celebrate that. They love that idea that I am a lot of many things. And in a class I had a few Fridays ago, a student said, but Miss, and this is a St. Lucian student, but Miss, aren't we all part Indians? So there is an embrace of that. There's an acceptance of that. But in terms of the governments of the Windward Islands, I don't think that has been a big priority. I will say that Indian Arrival Day has been celebrated in all of those countries, but they would not have been something which has been pushed by the government. You would have ministers of culture and so on who would later probably come and support it. So I was at an Indian Arrival Day celebration in St. Lucia, and you did have the Minister of Culture, who's now the Minister of Education, coming and talking and, celebrating it. But in terms of government policy, I don't think there's anything defined.
Do you think that should change then? Because we live in a world that is one polarized by identity politics. But on the second side, you've got countries or nations saying, we are doing public diplomacy, we have people-to-people relations. You know, St Lucia, for example, I had the pleasure of spending over 8 months on the island over there. So you meet with all the ministers, and yes, we're doing more with India. India's saying, yes, we're doing more with St Lucia because of the people-to-people relations, but neither the communities of India know anything about those of St Lucia, neither do the communities in St Lucia feel any type of sense that the government there is pushing them forward, saying, hey, great, let's celebrate your version of St Lucianness through your cultural guise. So it seems like everybody's talking about it on the top level, but there's practically not much changing. Like, surely that's going to have an impact. That's going to bite you later on, or are we just happy to be servants of that type of system?
I think part of it is that people never want to rock the boat. The government doesn't want to rock the boat. And by that, I'm not saying they want to cause friction and so on, but I think there's the sense that when government officials and probably even ordinary citizens are thinking about India, they're not thinking about it as a St. Lucian thing. Right? But a great part of there not being that kind of focus, as you're saying, is just because that information is not out there. It is not general knowledge. It is not general. So you may have spoken to the Minister Guy Joseph, and he might have information because he's of Indian descent. Okay, so he may have been more interested in that. But if you talk to the wider community, they don't have that understanding of St. Lucia heritage and its relationship with India. So that is absence. And probably that is a fault of the historian like myself who hasn't gone out there and been pushing that.
But that's really interesting because in St. Lucia, we hear of the African community that were there and how they came over. You hear about the wars between France and Britain over the islands. But the story of the Indian community that arrived are very, very small and far in between. Yeah, if you go to Vieux-Fort, if you go even towards the Pitons or Castries, you know, it's prevalent. You can see that there is this community there. They couldn't just arrived out of nowhere. They came somehow, but yet those stories are not recorded. It feels like that they're not really part of the history or the cultural makeup of St. Lucia.
And you are so correct in that. And even when I was doing my research, and we have the Folk Research Center, there was a little bit of work done on Indians. And some years before, you did have a gentleman who wrote a small pamphlet. But what the Folk Research Center was doing, and which they do fantastic work, and unfortunately their building has burnt down and all the records have gone, and that is a story of St. Lucia and information going up in smoke. But what their interest was generally was the cultural representations, which are very present. And a lot of those things were centered around Castries, around that urban center. And so a lot of that has to do with how the government is set up. And so up to the 1990s, government was focused only within Castries, within that urban center. And so a lot of the research you would have seen, like on Cayley and so on, a lot of that is communities within that general area. But they did fan out to places like Miku and so on when they are looking at other cultural practices. But I think that because government eyes aren't so much in those areas now, if you know it, we did have a prime minister who is from Vieux-Fort, who would have known those things, but there would not have been any concentration on examining those that community.
Is that Kenny Anthony that you're?
Yes, yes. And there's so much happening. But I was saying about the Folk Research Center. So they have been looking at those communities and cultural practices which are very public. And so part of the reason they have not examined the Indian community, it's partly because that has been kept very private, as I said before. But also even though we understand the importance of culture, the importance of the historical research is not there. That is absent. And I'm not even sure if history is still one of the subjects which gets scholarships. I'm not sure if it still is. When I was there, it was, but at the master's level, I could not have gotten a scholarship from the government. And so a big part is governments paying lip service to the importance of history and history education, but not doing what needs to be done. So there's no history of St. Lucia, or unless it's within social studies, taught at the primary level or the secondary level.
There's no history of indentureship that infected millions of people taught even in India. Because I think you told me that you were shocked. You spoke to professors over there and they said this is the first time they've ever heard about indentureship. How does that make you feel then? And how does that make the community feel, who are saying, on one token, India as a country, geographical location, is saying we're proud of our diaspora, you know, and let's do stuff together. On the other side, they've got no idea about the history of the diaspora, what they went through. And on the other side, you've got a community of people saying, well, we want to feel that we belong somewhere, but you can't even be bothered to study about us.
Yes, there's so many things in that. One, it has me wondering, how significant was the indentured? So many Indians leaving India. How did, what was the impact on the psyche of Indians in India? Did they feel that, you know, those numbers leaving? So in a village, when so many people left, how did people experience that? Now it is, what often happened was that people were already migrated, that this was just an additional migration. So from Uttar Pradesh, they would migrate to Calcutta. So, okay, maybe relatives, so therefore didn't hear from them, or just thought they had gone to the urban centers and so on, and then they continued to somewhere else. But I mean, these people went to Fiji, to Mauritius, to Reunion, to Suriname, to...
And they went through horrific circumstances in Fiji. There was the murder rate, South Africa, you know, the Indentured riots in the Caribbean, Guyana. Like, it's the stories aren't just of immigrants, it's the brutality of the situations that they found themselves in.
Right, and Gandhi, his presence in South Africa was among people who had been indentured. And Gandhi is this huge figure, and people have done so much research on Gandhi, but you don't see from India the research being done on those people who migrated.
Yeah.
And how is that even possible? But when I think about St. Lucia's and the knowledge about Indian indentureship there, because even when I was doing my research in Trinidad, a lot of the lecturers, a lot of the professors there who had worked on Indians, some of them, had very little knowledge of the community in St. Lucia. And so I am thinking that, one, because in the Caribbean we are islands, but also because we're so far removed from India, that story doesn't, like, they feel it doesn't connect. But also I am thinking, like, if a community who migrates is less than a certain percentage, that isn't see that small group.
Do you think that nullifies it?
Important enough to give any funding for research? You understand?
Yeah,
so
but surely there must be a residual frustration there, because not just for you, you're doing this incredible research that is pioneering the way communities look at themselves and actually giving a voice to say, let's actually understand the principles of human movement. What's that like, the brutality of it, and also the impact of identity. On the other side, you've got the country where a lot of people originated from not even bothering to teach these subjects or having an open discussion about them. Yet they're using that as a vise to connect the community for finances or remittances or for trade and business. And governments are happy to jump on that as well, where the very fabric of identity that is being played with is almost like a yo-yo. Like that must annoy you, if not your students.
I think in a way it's frustrating that you won't get much funding in that area, but it's frustrating because I think every story should get a voice. And India has a very long history, and Indian indentured labor is about 80 years of that story. But I think 80 years is enough for it to receive some sort of recognition in a general history of India. Now, a lot of the general histories of India I have read are not by Indians, are from people in the UK, especially originating in the UK. And their focus might have been part of the reason that we don't see that. And they're not, but another reason might actually be the archival situation. So when you do visit the archives in India, which I haven't done, but one of my friends had done because she had studied in India and would have returned there again. She was like, the documents are in a mess. And so she really had to sift through those. So those documents are the ones being preserved.
Well, here's another question then. Apart from India, even British history, we never learn about indentureship. We never learn about these connections that go beyond just the aspects of slavery where we learn about, but we never learn about this indentureship program, that it was across our entire globe. Why?
I think it's not even like you will see footnotes.
No.
You'll see an endnote.
It's like it doesn't exist. It never happened.
Right. And why that is the case, I cannot say that I'm totally sure. But one of the things was that Britain did not want to be accused of a second slavery. In fact, when suggestions were made that Indians be introduced all over the world, the British government was very reluctant and said, no, we're not going to have it. We are the champions of this new experiment, meaning using free workers, free laborers, wage laborers, and we are not going to go back into something which looks like slavery. However, there was so much pushback from plantation owners, and I think there was a certain sense of guilt on the part of the British government, who, when slavery ended, not only compensated the former enslavers with time by giving an extra 4 years of labor through the apprenticeship system, but also facilitated 20 million pounds, which is how many billions of pounds today. And that money continued to be paid up to 2016 in terms of taxes to cover that. The British government probably felt that it still needed to respect the fact that it went and took away private property from these plantation owners. And when these plantation owners said, we can't continue, all our estates are falling apart because you took away our slave labor, you need to give us something. And I think even though the British government was saying that it did not want to have a situation that looked too close to slavery, that they still felt that they owed something to the plantation owners.
But that doesn't make sense then, for the fact that this part of history seems to have, I wouldn't say scrubbed off, because scrubbed off would mean that it would have to be written down in the first place, then to be removed. It just never even made the pages.
Right, because I think one of the things was the indentured labor system, especially when it was coming to an end, was about World War One. And remember, Indians were looking to get their independence, and that did not happen. And in fact, I think part of the reason why the British government agreed to end Indian indentured labor in 1917 was because of the work Gandhi and Nehru and so on Gandhi more, I guess, and other nationalists, I guess, saying that they would not support the war effort. And I guess Britain didn't want it to become big news that they were asking for the end of indentured labor. And so I think around the war period, there was a kind of censorship. Even in the Caribbean, because we were former British territories, at the time, a lot of things were not being spoken about, not being written about in the newspapers and so on. So yes, Indian indentured labor would have come to an end, but it would seem that talking about Indians also came to an end. And Indians in the diaspora, who were part of the indentured system. And the writing of the Indian experience did not begin until the 1950s in the Caribbean, and that is with the arrival of the University of the West Indies. So the absence of a university in the Caribbean was one of the reasons why we didn't, and not just the absence of a university, maybe also of Indians being at those institutions. Would not have encouraged the writing of that history, but it still does not explain why within India that history is not better known. We have been working a lot with Indian diaspora organization, but these are all outside of India. And I think it would be important to get some organization within India, because it means that we would get more access to documents. It means that we would get more access to maybe information people have come across in their own, maybe stories they would have come across in their own research doing something else. And that also would, I think, ignite, because I think the idea of remittances should not just be a financial remittance, but Indians also hearing about the story of Indians who are in those places. I think that would be such a beautiful remittance, how Indians outside of India still were able to have these remarkable experiences and do so well in those communities, even when they are very small number, even when they are large numbers, and that to understand that, we're not just all internal, because of course, India was all for a very long time, was very internal to itself because of the geography and so on. But understanding that now India has this huge global diaspora, and what does that diaspora teach Indians in India?
Absolutely. That sounds exactly like the Global Indian series, doesn't it? So,
yes, I mean, it's not just dollars and cents. Remittances is not just dollars and cents.
Absolutely.
It is training, and we're talking about, India's exports so much, of its technical knowledge and personnel. But there are other people in the diaspora who have other skills who can help and return some of those things to India, but also the knowledge, the information. And I think in terms of pride, and I think that should not even be limited to India, because Pakistan is part of.
Absolutely. It's the entire community from those regions prior to partition to say, as people of the lands, this is what we got to be proud of. Because when those guys left, whether it was from UP, Bihar, wherever it may have been, they left a region to enter another one. When they look back, they don't look at a flag of India or flag of Pakistan. They look at a region to say, that's my ancestral home. But in order for them to feel some sense of pride there and some sense of belonging, the narrative has to be much more bigger than the tricolored state. It has to be about in-depth looking beyond that and saying, as identity as this movement of people have been picked up and splattered all over the globe, what are our stories? And now all of a sudden we're at the same level. There is nobody looking down or looking up and saying, oh, you guys left or you guys stayed. It's more so saying, as human beings from this one location, what an amazing story, but also what a heartfelt, brutal story it is, because people did lose their lives. People faced incredible hardship.
Yeah,
And so
100%.
it's
And
what
if we look at the early period, especially the numbers who died, the mortality, not just the mortality, the infant mortality, but also there was a very low birth rate among Indians when they initially arrived, settled in those areas. So knowing those stories, what we can see is literally a phoenix in all those different areas rising from that debilitating experience of indentured labor. I mean, even in Trinidad, when you look, when Indians arrived and they were just working, cutting sugar cane, but some of them were jewelers. And as soon as they left the estate, they began with their jewelry businesses, and these businesses still exist today. Some of them would have had branches in other Caribbean islands. And that is a beautiful story. And it is not just the story of the people who lost their caste because they crossed the Kalapani. And I think we also want to hear the stories of Indian families and so on who lost people to the indentured experience. It is working through that trauma. I think that is important. People left. People did not know their relatives left. Some of them knew, and it caused great humiliation for the families. But some of them left and they continued to have contact with their families and would later return to India. Or generations later, people like Basio Pandey and so on would return to India to look for that village where their ancestral families are located. And how are they dealing with those experiences? And I think we want to hear the Indian side of that too. I think that would just be so brilliant. It is like it is just like this huge sea waiting to be mined with, to be fished, to get all the different types of fish in that ocean. I'm thinking about it, and I've thought about it. And I'm like, why don't we know those stories so we can make those connections? Because the indentured experience wasn't just what the people who arrived experienced, but those people who lost, or not just lost family members, not thinking about it as a loss, but view those persons as people who are going to support them.
The human impact as well as experience that this had on everybody. In India, those who found themselves in new lands, the future generations, those kids, because they were now brought and thrust into a new community that they had to adapt. And then also having a look at how far were people willing to go to have a sense of belonging. You had people that knew their way out was, if I adopt the language and religion of the local land, I may get further, I may get better treatment. And so you see this huge shift, and this is the story of humans, this human behavior. There are no races, it's just an ethnicity, but it's these people just there and saying, what am I willing to do to survive? That's the brilliance of it.
And I am very sure that the oral tradition, we're not aware of it, but I'm sure there's families who have an oral tradition in India about what happened to these individuals, what were their experiences. I am very sure within certain homes and communities and villages, they have created a tradition around what are the stories of these people, but we have not gone in and investigated. And it would be so beautiful to piece all those stories and join them and make these connections.
A real tapestry of who we are.
Yes. And you say tapestry, and that's a fitting analogy because of how rich and how important the textile industry had been in India. So that is a wonderful, wonderful metaphor that we could go forward with.
Wonderful. Well, Kyneata, thank you very much for being on the show. It's been an intellectual, stimulating conversation, but I think it also plunges you into the notion that identity is much deeper to people compared to what most people realize. And we should be proud of that. But to be proud of that, we need more research done. We need to rekindle those things. And it's not about your perceived physical ethnic makeup. You can be proud to be of Indian origin, regardless of what the world thinks of you, because it's down to you. And likewise, you can be proud to be of African origin, regardless of what people's perception is of that, because your ethnicity is not based upon just your skin color.
Exactly. It's so many things. And as we say, there's just a human race, and you have these different groups within it, and different groups in terms of country, state, height.
Yeah.
It could be anything.
Yeah, absolutely. What a fantastic conversation. It's, I suppose what Kyneata's getting at, if I come down to the reality of the situations, that whether you're sitting in India, Malaysia, UK even more so, or anywhere else in the globe, we really don't learn much actually about what indentureship was like. There's this rosy, romanced version of the tales, whereby it looks like people are going off there to the newfound lands to enjoy themselves and to find new work and adventure. Well, I don't think we can be any further from the truth. It was a really brutal time. Over 50% of people died along those journeys, and quite close to 50% of those people, when they arrived in their destinations, also suffered illnesses and depression that led to death. They're horrendous figures. So next time we all sit down and people celebrate Indian Arrival Day, let's give a step back and realize just how brutal those situations were. I really hope you enjoyed this session. If you have any comments or things that you'd like to discuss, well, reach out to us. You know where we are. Go to the website. There you can follow us on social media, or you can ping me an email over direct. Truly hope you enjoyed the session, and I look forward to catching up with you next week. Take care for now.